When people talk about the masters of Japanese cinema, there are a few names that instantly jump to mind. Kurosawa, Ozu, Kobayashi, Mizoguchi. But one of the names that perhaps wouldn't be mentioned quite so readily is Hiroshi Shimizu. That is, unless you were to ask one of the Japanese masters themselves. Despite his relative obscurity today, Shimizu left an indelible mark on Japanese cinema. His career rode the crest of a highly shifting landscape of Japanese film as it made the transition from silent to sound. He directed over 160 feature films between 1924 and 1966, and he developed a thoroughly modern style similar to that of the neo-realists in the 1940s and 50s. His films are thoughtful, meditative studies on a changing society's effects on children, on outsiders, and on the most vulnerable. Shimizu's most well-known film, Arigato-san, or Mr. Thank You, was released in 1936, and though on the surface it seems like a very simple film about a polite bus driver and the people he picks up as he drives through the rural Izu Peninsula towards Tokyo, scratch a little deeper and what's revealed is a poignant study of Depression-era Japan. It's also an excellent example of Shimizu's distinctive style and why I think his work is in serious need of reappraisal both in the West and in his native Japan. Welcome to 100 Years of Cinema. We'll be taking a look at least one film each year from 1915 onwards to track the evolution of film over the last century. Shimizu's films examine the world at its most pure by looking at the people who inhabit it and their role in society. They often operate on very basic premises. A troublemaking child has to deal with being moved to a new town. A group of war orphans and a soldier must walk across Japan. A boarding school teacher has to try and connect with a troubled student, or in the case of Arigato-san, a bus driver must take his passengers along the winding road through the mountains of the Izu Peninsula en route to Tokyo. But in their simplicity, these films approach the sublime. It's by examining the most basic elements of society, the people on the lowest rung of the social ladder, that Shimizu paints a broader picture of society as a whole. Shimizu was born in the city of Shizuoka in 1903, and he started his career at a time when Japanese cinema was still very much in its infancy. But being the child of a wealthy industrialist and attending university in the bustling port city of Sapporo meant that by the time he began producing films in 1924, he'd been exposed to a huge variety of cinema from around the world. And this global influence had a major effect on Shimizu's work. Even in Shimizu's earlier films, like Japanese Girls at the Harbour, there is a tremendous sense of modernity. Shimizu took an extremely dynamic approach to filmmaking. His near constantly moving camera and almost experimental editing showed that this is a director who had incredible command over his image and an unparalleled sense of visual storytelling. Shimizu was an experimenter in all things. Unlike in the West, where the transition to sound happened almost immediately, Japanese cinema slowly converted over a period of about 10 years as it tried to balance the new technology with the country's unique cinematic style. Shimizu's first talkie, A Woman Who Wept in Spring from 1933, was shot on location in the snow-capped hills of Hokkaido, and its experimental mixture of sound and music was somewhat revolutionary in Japan, inspiring Yasujiro Ozu to make his own jump to synchronize sound with The Only Son. This experimentation with sound, combined with Shimizu's insistence on shooting on location, forced Shimizu to simplify his narratives, and resulted in what would become his signature style: simple, almost plotless films with deep, expressive, and sometimes subversive themes, with a strong focus on realism and naturalistic performances. Arigato-san is a perfect example of this distinctive style and contains most of the elements that would come to be associated with his work. His signature tracking shots that take on the perspective of a traveller and seem to be inviting the viewer into becoming an active explorer in the world that he's created. His frequent use of wide shots that capture the scope of rural communities where man intertwines with nature, and his exploration of groups as a microcosm of society as a whole. Shimizu often uses idyllic images, picturesque locations, and cheerful music as a mask for social criticism and an exploration of human nature. In The Masseurs and a Woman, the beautiful landscape of an onsen retreat covers for a story about the loneliness felt by those with disabilities and a powerful need for human connection. Through the gentle comedy of Children in the Wind, we see the emotional depth that children are capable of and the sadness felt when an idealized image of a family is shattered. And in Arigato-san, the winding mountain roads and gentle charm of a slice-of-life comedy covers for the devastating effect of Japan's economic depression on the lives of its people, particularly those who live in rural communities. Inside the bus, there is a young girl travelling to Tokyo with her elderly mother. A modangaru, or moga, the Japanese equivalent of a 1930s flapper, a mustachioed and lecherous businessman, and of course the polite bus driver himself, Arigato-san, each of whom represent different aspects of Japan's changing society as the country worked its way out of a depression and moved towards industrialization and militarism. In lieu of a traditional plot, Shimizu presents us with a series of short vignettes, each of which reveal more about the lives of the passengers and by extension, Japanese society. But just as important as the passengers is what Shimizu is trying to tell us about the people we pass en route. Through the windows of the bus, we see labourers and farmers, blind men travelling alone, the wealthy and impatient in their personal cars, travelling performers, people looking for work in the spas and retreats of the peninsula, and the dejected returning home after failing to find jobs in the city. Shimizu was somewhat obsessed with rural communities and the people who lived there. His films present a dichotomy between the city and the countryside. In his earlier city-based films, like Japanese Girls at the Harbour and Seven Seas, the city is presented as a place of vice, where modern values of greed and lust supersede the basic morality of compassion and generosity, whereas his rural settings are seen as places of recuperation and tightly knit communities. It's therefore no coincidence that the bus ride taking the people from rural Izu to Tokyo is also later revealed to be a journey taking a young girl from a poor but loving family to a life of servitude and sexual exploitation in Japan's burgeoning metropolis. What emerges through all of this is the work of a filmmaker with a huge capacity for empathy. Through the happy veneer of Shimizu's world, he reveals the darkness plaguing people's lives. This is perhaps most clear when the bus driver meets and expresses condolences with the Korean labourers who built the road. Shimizu explores the sadness and emptiness of their lives and goes as far as to imply that the driver and the passengers are indirectly benefiting from their exploitation. And by extension, this serves as a tacit condemnation of the Japanese attitude towards migrant workers, a sentiment that would have been radical and controversial in 1936 and possibly illegal when Japan's censorship policy was tightened under the film laws in 1939. These are small films, but their impact is enormous. And it's Shimizu's empathy that makes these films what they are. Shimizu's focus is on the small things, and by capturing life as it really is, he allows us to connect with his characters as if they were real people. This could mean a child climbing a tree out of frustration or coming clean about hiding cigarettes. It could be a teacher finally reaching out to a student, or a person deciding who they'll share their food with and who they'll ignore. These tiny moments are like windows into another world. There is an honesty and a beauty to these films. They invite you to share in both the light and the dark of these characters' life so that you can connect on a very basic and pure level. Sadly, Shimizu died before his time in 1966, and maybe because of this, his legacy has been overshadowed by some of his contemporaries. But for me, Shimizu stands among the masters of Japanese cinema. His kindness and empathy extended beyond the screen. He used his personal wealth to build orphanages for children who had lost their families in the war, and he was known to pay for the education and housing of the child actors that appeared in his films. It's this same empathy and generosity that make his films so enchanting. The feelings are real. Much like the bus ride itself, Shimizu's films are journeys into some of the saddest and darkest places of the human soul, but he goes there with a humility and a lightness that allows anybody to journey with him. He creates warm, rich worlds, and it's easy to become absorbed in their charm. But the real genius is how he pulls you into the lives of his characters, placing you in a real seeming world, zeroing in the seemingly small details that make up people's lives, placing the vulnerable, needy, and helpless at the center of his stories. This is the cinema of real life, and through the director's empathy, the audience can empathize too. Thanks for watching 100 Years of Cinema. My name's Charlie. I want to take a moment to say thank you to all the people that support me on Patreon, particularly my latest supporters, Keith Angel and Pepsi Man EXE. Thank you guys very much. My favourite Shimizu film is actually Children of the Beehive, but I'm not sure whether it's ever really had a US or a UK release, so I put a link to that on YouTube in the information box below. You'll also find a link to the Criterion box set that contains 4 of Shimizu's films, including Arigato-san, and it's really worth checking that out. Let me know what you think in the comment box below, and you can follow me on Twitter if you want to talk about Shimizu or any other filmmaker. Watch more of my videos over here, subscribe, and you can support me on Patreon as well as gain access to exclusive videos, this time about the origins of Japanese cinema, by clicking over here.
自動車の中にもタヌキがいるよ。ひげを生やしたタヌキが。